You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we are joined by Dr. Ranon Nachman and Brad Cox to discuss Project PEACES, a nationwide study on autistic college student success. Dr. Nachman, an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and Dr. Cox, an associate professor at Michigan State University and founder of the College Autism Network, share insights on supporting autistic students in higher education and fostering inclusive learning environments. Today, we'll be discussing the groundbreaking research and its implication for colleges and students alike. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Nachman and Dr. Cox.
Thanks for having us.
Indeed. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, this is a topic that I think oftentimes is when you're thinking about neurodiversity and you're talking about the autistic experience, sometimes that college life, that assimilation into what the college experience is and post-secondary experience in general is not something that is the hot topic, the one that's out there. But before we go there, I'd love to hear from both of you. And I think we'll start with you, Dr. Cox, is what sparked your interest in the field of autism and neurodiversity, and what led it to this specific topic?
So this is a story that Brett will be familiar with because it's a story I've told a few times. But I was a faculty member and assistant professor at Florida State University when our son, at the age of 4, was diagnosed with autism. And I, like a lot of people at the time, and like a lot of parents, when we first heard that, I had no idea what it meant. And I was admittedly a little unsure what to think, unsure of how it would affect him, how would it affect our family. And at that point, I did a lot of what I would think a good faculty member does. And I went and read a lot of research on autism, how it affects families, how it affects kids. And it turns out that after about a semester of doing that, Florida State talked to me and said, you know, Brad, good job being a good parent, but you also need to be a good faculty member. And I realized at that point that I could not really bifurcate my life into a home life that was all of a sudden thrust into this space of autism in a work life that was independent of it. And so, having long studied the factors that contribute to post-secondary success for other groups of students and in a variety of ways, I sought to merge the two, to marry the two. And ever since then, I have been focusing the bulk of my efforts on trying to understand the personal and institutional and societal characteristics that contribute to student access, experiences, and outcomes for college students with autism. So, like a lot of folks, it's intensely personal work as well.
Yeah, and having that personal nature to it oftentimes leads to kind of more creativity, more passion in some of the discoveries that are happening. And I can't wait to get into the conversation on this because I'm curious where those differences are and where the similarities are to what you did prior to with post-secondary success to what you're looking at now. But we'll get there. And Brett, tell me how you kind of got into this field and where your passion stemmed from.
Yeah, like Brad, it's intensely personal. And I have always lived with autism. I was diagnosed at the time with Asperger's when I was 8. But it wasn't until my college years that I started to really try to reconcile and make sense of how my autism manifested and would be accepted by others in the higher education landscape. In community college, I was our keynote student commencement speaker, and that was a space where I disclosed my autism experiences for the first time publicly. We're talking about 12-ish years ago now, so the landscape, I think, has markedly changed in terms of how we make sense of autism, how we accept it, as opposed to just being aware of it. And it wasn't until I started graduate school in the field of higher education, where I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I realized the most meaningful research that I could conduct would not only be the personal side of my immersion scholarship on community college transfer students, but also investing myself in work related to autism in higher education, for which we're talking about a decade ago now, and there wasn't much scholarship at all that existed then. And I realized, you know what, I'm going to be I want to contribute to the space. I think it's going to do something for me, but probably a lot of other folks like me. And within a year of starting grad school, I met a colleague, Dr. Kirsten Brown, who we started collaborating. She had published some recent work on autism in community colleges. And in a matter of months, not only did we work together, but she put me in connection with Brad, who had just founded the College Autism Network at the time. And little would I have known that our sense of community and similar interests and values would manifest in many collaborations, a great friendship, and ultimately a lot of meaningful work over the past 8 years that we've been a team.
Well, I appreciate, I mean, 100% the fact that you were willing to be able to kind of explore this, because it's not all the time that you have somebody where they take a personal experience and say, you know what, I'm going to look at this and try and be able to empower everybody else through the same experiences. And maybe this is an aside, but I'm curious. Did you feel that there was a point maybe 10, 15 years ago, maybe now, where, decisions were being made for the neurodiverse population in the absence of having a solidified voice versus being able to say, hey, you know what? This is my experience. I can tell you my own experience. Why don't you listen to that and let me guide you where we should be looking next? Have you seen a shift? Is it still going, or am I kind of assuming something on my own that, hey, you know what, I hear more voices about it, so maybe things are changing? Oh, I'm sorry, Brett.
We're so respectful of one another in terms of how we want to contribute. I think it's change is slow, change is inconsistent, and change is highly contextual. And consequently, the autism acceptance movement, if you will, on college campuses is very much driven by the stakeholders in spaces who have that as a priority by virtue of their personal connections, or for many who work directly in that space as folks working in disability services offices and disability advocacy organizations and autism support programs. So I think there's definitely a greater sense of understanding and appreciation of the autistic experience. And I would credit a lot of the practitioners who are our colleagues who are doing that meaningful work, and in tandem with the research that folks are putting out there that are illuminating their experiences, and as well greater conversations about neurodiversity more generally. So I think in many ways it's been much more palatable and familiar to folks.
Yeah, and these conversations is what guides future thought. It guides future policy, and it guides ultimately experience for a bunch of people. And it's not just the neurodiverse population that learns from all of this. It's everybody. And this is where I kind of wanted to go back to, Brad, you worked initially in being able to empower everybody through secondary education success. Now you've focused more on the neurodivergent population. Is there that big of a bridge to what you're actually trying to focus on for somebody to be successful? Or is it just a level of, I'm going to tailor things differently. I'm going to look at experiences slightly more. Where on the spectrum is that?
So it's a lot like any student population that we start looking at, right? There are certainly things that are common across the college experience that are true for most, if not all, of the students who are entering and continuing through higher education. They all attend classes. They all have to have a life outside of classes. They all have to interact with faculty members, navigate the environment that includes other students, administrators, policies, and finances. So there are definitely commonalities. And there's also commonalities in terms of the things that are important to or challenging for students. And at the same time, there are certain things that are either uniquely or probably not exclusively, but uniquely or especially important or relevant to the autistic and neurodivergent student population. And it's interesting because sometimes we end up finding that what is true for autistic students is the same thing that's true for everybody. And that's both it's a double-edged sword, right? Is that, yeah, great. That means that the things that are already in place or that are trying to help the broader student population are going to be relevant and helpful for this student population. But then when we see when we share that kind of research, it also then, implicitly undermines the need to give this population the focused attention to generate the environments and the policies and the practices that would be uniquely contributing to this specific student population. So it's a both and both. And in terms of there's some unique stuff to autism and some things that are shared in common, but also both and in terms of its implications. So it can be both positive and can lead to trouble as well.
No, and that makes sense. I think that as you're looking at it, it's how much resource do you put to any single barrier that might exist for somebody, and it's unique to that individual as well, I'm sure. But if you have some understanding of a population to say, hey, you know what, there's probably going to be needed more resources here, then you can allocate that. I've spoken with friends who have their children in college who are neurodivergent. And some of the things that at least what they indicated were, the fears of this is their first time in a social environment where it's complete independence. This is the first time where they're going to potentially be challenged with more thought divergence where, I need to sit there and be able to have the debate back and forth was one of the things that, because their child was extremely, extremely bright, extremely intelligent, but had a little bit more difficulty seeing the other perspective. Some of the other things we're navigating, how in the world do I even build my schedule? What do I even do? I've never had to sit there and plan. Brett, what are some of the common things? I mean, is this experience that my friend had, is that normal as far as, some of the consistent resources that are needed? Or are there other themes that you're seeing?
Well, Jeff, I think you're touching on several of the different experiences marked that are experiences that are common among autistic folks, and a lot of it is going directly back to their family background, right? To what extent are their parents engaging in a lot of decision making for them, as opposed to, as you say, right, a greater sense of independence in college? And that's something that I've explored in some of my dissertation work and other spaces. And what we see is that there's a lot of value in this idea of interdependence, where and this notion of seeking out resources, but knowing that there are always people you can turn to. It's okay and important to be able to leverage resources and advocate for yourself, and it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. The challenges often emerge in college when the autistic student does not have the foundation to be able to know what to seek out and to know what questions to ask. And some of that responsibility falls on the family. Some of that responsibility falls on the college. And then there's also a certain degree of trial and error that every student has to experience. And just because a social interaction is a little bit awkward for someone, or maybe you get the wrong information, does not make someone a failure or make a situation completely unsuccessful. It's learning experiences, and I think that's what so many of us in higher education as a field, and Brad and I as folks who study higher education appreciate, is that students need to make mistakes, but students also need to know that it's okay for things to not always work wonderfully, and that there are people that they can turn to. And it's finding that right balance. And that's what's really hard, right? You talk about the scheduling, which all goes back to executive functioning. You talk about, seeking out different spaces on campus for whether it be advising and tutoring or counseling, whatnot. All students need to know what resources exist to them. How the student navigates the situation is going to be very individualized. And it's going to be even more nuanced for the autistic folk if the people they're engaging with do not have the familiarity with autism or neurodiversity and can appreciate certain differences in communications or norms. And that's where we push for a lot of changes in terms of campus structures to be more neurodiversity inclusive and affirmative. But I'd say a lot of it goes back to how students are raised and the families they come from, but also recognizing too, a lot of autistic folks in college may not have formal diagnoses and may be discovering their diagnoses in college. We see, we're kind of preaching to the choir. We all know that there are delayed diagnoses among women, among folks who are people of color, and additional marginalized identities. And so consequently, that means that there's a lot of reconciliation and a lot of labor, unfortunately, that is put on the autistic individual to figure things out, as opposed to knowing the bevy of different resources that are at their disposal if they know what to access.
No, absolutely. And I want to go ahead, Brad. Sorry.
Well, I actually wanted to touch on two things, but you brought me to a third. But I'll touch on two things that I think Brett referenced. When I talk to parents or students or others who are wanting to help their autistic family member, friend, whatever, do well in college, the single biggest encouragement I offer them is to work with your student so that when they arrive on campus, they are able to effectively self-advocate. And that is inclusive of work that has to happen before they get to college and practices and experiences they have there. It also has to be able to happen in different environments. So they'll have to be an advocate at times within their own, let's say their residence hall, or in a dining room, or in a classroom, or with a disability services center. And the way in which you approach advocacy can look different in each of those settings and with each of the people you're advocating with. It can be subtle, it can be direct. It has a lot of variability in terms of how it can happen. But I'll echo Brett's point about the role of the family in doing that. And here's where I'll get a little bit of pushback on the family part of this. I'm a family member, right? My kid is now, oh my God, we're looking at colleges now. That freaks me out just a little bit, to be clear, because when I started the College Autism Network, I actually stood up there and said, like, hey, my kid is 10 years away from going to college. I hope colleges are ready for him when he gets to that age. He's almost to that age. But as we're looking, and I'm thinking about my own role as a parent, most of us who have had a long time to know that our child was autistic and work with our child who's autistic are really intensely involved in a whole lot of their lives, more so than perhaps other families. And so it is going to be a dramatic shift for us as parents who have invested so much hands-on time, energy, and in our case, my wife and I both study similar topics, so now we know an awful lot about autism. And then when you make the transition to college, the role of the parent fundamentally shifts. And so that's a challenge for the student to adapt. But as a parent, I'm realizing now that I need to start working in ways that are going to prepare him to work without me, watching over him every step, but that I got to learn to let it go and to let him be, to trust that what we have taught him and the skills that he's developed, including those self-advocacy skills, mean that he's ready to take on a degree of independence that we haven't really given him the space to do in K-12 settings. And that's a hard lesson for parents to learn when they've spent 10 or 20 years trying to take care of their kid in all kinds of ways.
No, it is. I think it's hard for somebody with a neurotypical child as well. I mean, I'm going through the same experience with my daughter, and everything that you're talking about is like, all right, so yes, self-advocacy, self-awareness, the ability to be able to fail and have resilience, like all of these things. But when I think about, how the learning environment is set up for a lot of people who are neurodivergent prior to post-secondary education, they're sheltered oftentimes from failure, just in the way that we're setting up a teaching environment. And that needs to change. The self-advocacy, it's something that ideally is that the field of treatment services have moved to respecting more rather than being a compliant individual is that they are a self-assertive individual that, has a voice in their own system. And then even self-awareness. It's like, if you can't explore the world around you, how do you know who you are yet? Like there's all these things and it seems like they line up quite a bit. Is this something that you say parents need to be focused on this? Is this something that needs to trickle down into the primary, secondary school systems as well? Because these skills don't come, they don't come overnight. It's something that, like, if you wait too long, you might have waited too long to prepare somebody. Should it start earlier? Is that where you're pushing some of this research to?
So Brett, I'll leave you to talk about the idea for the vision grant that we recently applied for. But I think it is a huge problem that these skills are a secondary consideration, if that, in a traditional K-12 setting. I've been to a lot of different IEP meetings with lots of different people at lots of different schools and spaces. And, by design, I guess, or at least by norm and history, the conversations have long and almost exclusively focused on academics. And when you talk about compliance, right, like one of the things that we've heard is that our students, our son, who is getting good grades, right, that he doesn't create problems, he doesn't struggle in the classes, so they don't know what kind of accommodations to make for. And it's a push that we have to look at some of the things beyond the academics, like the self-advocacy, the social communication, the friendship and relationship building. Those kinds of things are every bit as important to his success, including his academic success. But they don't really get highlighted. And I absolutely think that's a problem with teachers, with administrators, special educators, that oftentimes, personally, we have found ourselves having to go outside of the school system to help our son develop some of those skills, or to get him the supports that we think have at least contributed a little bit to his development of those skills. But I don't think Brett and I are content to just leave it as is. So I think I'll let him talk about like our upcoming project that we're working on.
Yeah, we recognize one of the things that has been really core to Brad's work and mine too is bringing a variety of different groups of folks together. So the College Autism Network, I think, is an illustration of that, an organization that brings together faculty, researchers, disability staff members, employers, self-advocates, among other groups as well. And we find in those spaces that the best conversations and outcomes unfold when folks are in conversation with one another, right? We're not siloed. And I think some of the issues that we see in practice and in research is that there are those divisions of folks being in their own spaces and not engaging perspective taking, not communicating with one another, and thus not reconciling that very difficult transition to college. So a project that Brad and I have early in development, at least via grant proposal at this juncture, is all about better facilitating autistic student transitions across different junctures, including from high school to college to employment as well. And we just find in so many environments, yes, it's useful to communicate with folks and have those dialogues among folks who have the similar jargon, who know the same people, who know the same things. But there's even more merit when we're engaging in conversation across those spaces. So our work is looking into that direction, if you will, and even some of our current work, including our Autistic College Student Success Study, is representative of the value of accounting for a variety of different stakeholders and domains of students' lives, as we've talked a little bit about today.
As you've uncovered some of these findings, and I think I'm going to go towards the line of thinking of the college culture and those resources once somebody is in that community college environment. I would imagine most of the administrators want to do the right thing and maybe just didn't know how to go about providing some of those resources, the accommodations, the extra supports where necessary, the education to the community on, we have a diverse environment. This is kind of how we all need to work. what are some of the things that you've moved into or suggested that colleges adopt? And have you seen it as successful from the administrators all the way down to the students? And I think I'll throw this one to Brad first, and then Brett, if you have some added info, that'd be wonderful.
All right. I've been in higher education long enough that I've become a cynic about a few things that you seem to imply you have like good feelings about, good vibes about. I definitely think that administrators and high level school leaders are recognizing that this is a population that warrants attention. Oftentimes, that attention is driven by, at least at the local level, at institution level, by somebody high up who has a particular interest in this population and then makes that interest known, and the community responds around that person. That's great if you have a president whose nephew is autistic, or you have your primary donor say, I want to give you $1 million or $10 million to start this center. That's fantastic. The trouble, I would argue, comes when there isn't that immediate and intense champion, which frankly, at most institutions, there's not, because without the leader making it a centerpiece of the effort, and without somebody who's willing to foot the bill, sadly, helping support autistic students and getting them through college can be, in a very business oriented world of higher education, a investment that doesn't necessarily give the greatest yield of return on investment. If the population of students is relatively small, and from what we can tell, it is, right? No more than 2%, more like 1 and 1.5%, depending on which studies you're looking at. And a lot of them are doing well, and fewer than half of them self-disclose. That's a relatively small group of students to spend money on supporting in uniquely autistic supportive ways. Now, that's my cynical side. There are plenty of schools who are doing great work on this. Brett actually started the list of schools that are offering autistic specific support programs, but realistically, that's like a stepping stone. It's only so much that these narrowly defined and relatively small programs can do to support these students. What really needs to happen is one of the things that the College Autism Network is working on a pilot project for, which is to develop a truly autism inclusive campus. One where autistic students feel comfortable and know that they have access to the resources they need to be successful, know that they have opportunities to gain the skills they need to be successful, know that they'll be accepted and appreciated for who they are within that space. And those are a little slower in developing, because changing any institutional culture is a much bigger lift than designating an office and hiring a staff member to run your autism center. That said, those autism centers are doing some good stuff, right, Brett?
Absolutely. Well, and I think, Brad illustrates a really good point about that personal connection often making a difference in terms of the efforts that unfold on a campus. I think what campuses are realizing, though, in tandem with that, is that many practices on campus that support autistic folks are actually going to be very beneficial to everybody. So, of course, there's been the movement for universal design for learning, which is grounded in disability work and the notion of making adaptations and offering choice and embracing alternative forms of engagement are not only helpful for your autistic learners, but everybody. And I think it's in that spirit that we see a lot of campuses on the kind of jumping on the bandwagon of like, what can we do to make our campuses, more inclusive from a teaching standpoint or whatnot. But we also recognize that there's a lot of nuance in the autism community in terms of what supports different folks may need to feel at ease, right? For some, it's sensory friendly spaces and study rooms. For others, it's having clubs and organizations on campus that are either about their autism identity or about Dungeons and Dragons, for which we've seen some scholarship and actual practice of many people are drawn toward. I'm someone in the autism community who does not find the appeal of Dungeons and Dragons, but that's okay. What Brad and I and our colleagues have done through our autistic college student success study called PEACES is ascertained not only the priorities of success that autistic college students notate, but also capturing from them, learning from them what changes they want to see on campus that would better support and facilitate their success. And it's not just getting good grades, but it's feeling a sense of community. It's finding the right pathways to employment. It's making sure they're avoiding burnout. And collectively, all of those insights are not only illustrative of what may help autistic college students be successful, but we might find some transferable elements that are actually beneficial for all of our college students. There's just differences in the autism community based on, how we think, how we communicate, and ultimately how we navigate the world.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying, and I think what you were saying as well, Brad, is that it makes sense, and I understand your skepticism, but at the same time, is that I think that even if the system isn't built, there's going to be champions that maybe aren't the ones that are at the highest level. There could be faculty members, there could be advisors, there could be administrators that still want to do the right thing. And I was looking at your site, and it seems like you have some simple recommendations that were put out there that can kind of help support some of those individuals that maybe are saying, hey, you know what, I'm a faculty member, I want to help support. These are some of the things that I could just make integral. I can kind of make sure that I'm doing on an individual level. Are there recommendations that you have for specific people as far as, maybe your system isn't set up for everybody to succeed, but you as an individual can contribute?
Yeah, and Brad, maybe you and I can just talk about some different examples of stakeholders based on what we're seeing in the work and in practice. I think in terms of our faculty members on campus and on campuses, and maybe to some extent this extends to high school instructors as well. It's about leveraging students' interests, passions, and skill sets. I'm a huge proponent that any student in any classroom is going to produce better work when they feel a sense of relevance and engagement in the topic at hand. And I think the more avenues that we educators can provide for all of our students, inclusive of our autistic learners, to capitalize on those passions, as long as it has some connection to the course at hand, there's a lot of opportunity for growth and for students to feel a sense of success and value. So I think that's a general practice where all educators can make adaptations. As far as in our classrooms, I think back to some of our findings too. It's so important for educators to be facilitators of group work and kind of modeling expectations for group assignments. Think of, for some students, regardless of if they're autistic or not, how it's sometimes hard to approach someone new and to figure out if they want to collaborate or to figure out who's going to handle this role in a group. Educators hold a responsibility in setting those norms, trying to find the most valuable ways to bring people together and to ensure that everybody can demonstrate their strengths and skills in those contexts. And I think all college students need support with that, but particularly in the autism community, where sometimes new social situations are very anxiety producing, or where they're not always clear about, is it my turn to participate, or should I step in this way? Little adaptations can go a long way. And through all of the interviews that Brad and I have conducted over the years with autistic students, in tandem with some of my lived experiences and others, I think we can attest to the fact that it's not always sweeping changes that are necessary or make the biggest impact. It's sometimes those individual elements at the classroom level. So I think it's worth noting some of those from a faculty standpoint. Brad, I'm not sure if you want to kind of jump in with some other groups of folks.
Yeah, so two things that come to mind from two different studies. So one from the PEACES project that Brett and I are leading right now, that when students were asked to report the things that were most helpful to them, a lot of times they referenced academic things. So being in the courses they want, having or developing the necessary academic skills. Faculty have a direct role in those experiences. So we mentioned universal design for learning earlier, flexibility, adaptability, being available, providing explicit guidance as much as possible. Those kinds of things are incredibly helpful. And instructors were listed as one of those things that was particularly important to them. But I want to highlight another group of people, which is the friends. And the friends are important to students, both as something that they want and that when they work well, our students report that their friends are among the most helpful in facilitating their college success. And that could be because they have somebody to talk to about things that are important to them, somebody who accepts them for who they are. Maybe it's somebody who helps them understand what needs to happen to be a successful student because their friend's a successful student. There's all kinds of roles that can play, and we all have heard about the occasional challenges that autistic students face when in a space that is primarily neurotypical and around students who may not entirely understand the autistic student who they are. So whatever we can do, particularly early in a student's experience, to help facilitate those connections in a safe, accepting, and meaningful way, I think will go a good long way towards helping these students. But then the second piece I want to bring in is a study that I was a part of. In fact, it was part of my very first research in autism in higher education. When I was talking to students, and this was 8-10 years ago, a lot of these students talked about their college experience as a series of problems that they encountered or first recognized. Then as they worked their way through them, they had to reframe what those problems were or how they thought about those problems, and then how to resolve those problems. And so as they were doing so, there's this little chart that I can share sometime, but when you think about the institutional norms or the systems that you were just talking about, like there are a lot of things about higher education and institutions of post-secondary ed with that, there's some tension there between those norms, expectations, and structures and the characteristics of individuals with autism. That creates a tension that often then needs to be reframed into a spot where a student needs to develop a stronger sense of themselves as autistic, as a college student, so that they oftentimes, the students I talk to, would then go to their disability service office and say, hey, I'm autistic, I want these accommodations, or I have this challenge, can you help me solve it? But then the students who reported genuinely resolving the problem and stopped thinking of it as a problem at all are the folks who used their personal connections to work with an individual at the institution, a faculty member, a staff member, an administrator, built that one-on-one relationship so that they got what I called personalized adaptation from the college. That was not just applying some policy, but recognizing that policy can be enforced in different ways and to different extents, that there are not just exceptions to be made, but ways to implement policies that had previously not been considered that would be perfectly consistent with what the policy says, but that had never been thought of through the lens of an autistic individual. And now when that autistic individual is working directly with a person who is involved in creating or implementing that policy, all of a sudden eyes open up and some of those policies can be revisited in ways that are helpful to autistic students, which, as Brett said, generally speaking, are going to be helpful to the entire range of college students.
Absolutely. And if you can personalize something and make it so that somebody can connect to a cause or an issue that you have, is that now you have an ally. And so I love that thought process. But when you both were kind of talking about all the things that somebody needs to be able to navigate in college, I'm thinking about, these are the same, so when you go to college, you've lost your social network. You've lost your support network. The skill that I need to be able to enter into college or any other new environment is the ability to kind of go in and know How do I approach others? Who are the people that I actually want to be around? And this is for all people. It's like, how do I establish new relationships? And that is a skill that sounds like if I can establish new relationships, establish healthy relationships, college now just got a whole lot easier. But these aren't always the skills that are being worked on from childhood all the way up as much as they should be. But that's what you need. You need to be able to establish relationships. You need to self-advocate. You need to know who you are. How does that look post-college? Because it sounds like the same skills are going to be needed again. Like I need to be able to assimilate into a job setting. I need to know that this job is one that I'm passionate about, that I want to work on. Like, is that a bridge that you all are also tackling? Is that next level of transition post-college? Brett, maybe you have some
Yeah.
insight on that.
Yeah, and I will say that most of Brad and my work is embedded in the higher education landscape, but we realize that that is in many ways a bridge to employment, and it's also not untethered from employment because many autistic college students, like neurotypical college students, are employed while in college, right? And they're gaining the skills and connections to find those viable pathways. What's hard though in many areas is we just don't know what that looks like for autistic employees, right? There's emergent scholarship and really great scholarship out of some folks in the UK. I think of Jonathan Vincent and folks among others who are charting the experiences of autistic employees, and particularly that post college transition. And what we're seeing is that, much like colleges, right, autistic folks need to be in neurodivergent friendly workplaces and places where they have mentors, they have go-to people they can turn to for advice and guidance, much like any new employee. The difference is that it's all about being in a space where there's recognition of autism and at times making adaptations so that that autistic employee can thrive. What that might look like may vary according to the discipline or industry rather. So, for instance, having greater flexibility from a location standpoint, right? More folks working remotely, or perhaps building in more breaks, or handling tasks in maybe a slightly unconventional way, but it still accomplishes the job. What Brad and I are looking at by virtue of our work on autistic college student success is employment as a piece that facilitates success. And so many students in our nationwide survey of autistic undergrads finds that about half, if I remember correctly, Brad, about half are employed. And those folks who are working are sometimes doing so in their fields of study and interest areas. Others may be holding multiple jobs or internships. But this is a foundational time for folks to explore what works for them. And that's where the college has a certain responsibility in partnerships with local employers and companies that are receptive to and going to provide the appropriate supports to autistic employees, but also that students are getting the appropriate skills in the classroom and those other contexts so that they can be the best possible employees they can be. This is still a relatively unexplored area in both research and practice because unfortunately, the reality is that a lot of autistic folks are unemployed or underemployed. There's also a lot of employees out there who are autistic and they just may not have that diagnosis. And there's some really cool work out of, I think out of Australia with Sandra Jones and colleagues, where they're looking at autistic academics experiences. There's a lot of autistic people working in academia. I'm one of them, and there's many more. And where someone works in the industry they may be in is often a huge indicator of how successful they'll be because of what those norms are and where people can demonstrate their passions and have those appreciated. So hopefully that gives a little bit of perspective. This is a really exciting and relatively novel area. And I think based on the spaces where Brad and I embed our work, which is kind of at the precipice of employment and to some extent going into that space, it's really very exciting and it makes me encouraged by virtue of learning from our student participants what success means to them through the lens of employment and being able to follow their passions into meaningful careers.
In the PEACES project, findings from the PEACES project have indicated that students value a variety of different things or define success in a variety of different ways. But employment in their interest area and getting a job that allows them to be financially independent are really high priorities for these students. And again, this is a thing that is not, exclusive to autistic students, but it was a good reminder for us that getting from high school into college is itself an important and sometimes difficult transition. But as Brett mentioned, oftentimes higher education is seen as that bridge to the employment. And this is particularly important when a lot of the environmental shifts that happen from high school to college are replicated or modified when you get into the employment workspace. And so we talked a little bit about how K-12 settings weren't always doing the best job of getting a student ready to self-advocate or to have those non-academic skills they would need for college. I would argue that there are a lot of higher education institutions that aren't really set up to help students with autism make that next transition into the workplace. And that has to do with how we go about doing career fairs or resume reviews or interview practices. And then the last bit I'll note about employers, just like in higher education, a lot of this work started with a handful of people at a handful of schools creating a handful of programs, and that have now developed enough that we are hoping to take the lessons learned there and apply them to a broader swath of institutions and to apply them institution-wide in changing cultures on those campuses. I think the same thing is starting to happen in the workplace as well. We have at the College Autism Summit, where we are hosting, about 200, 300 folks every year, a really large and growing proportion of those folks are at workplaces or companies that have autism support programs or like the neurodiversity hiring initiative. And while we know that they're putting in that extra effort to support the successful transition to the workforce for these students, we know they're doing it for the purpose of profit, not just, the goodwill of the world or to try to do the right thing. And some of them, I believe, are starting to realize that if they can make the whole company a place where autistic folks want to be and can be and are successful, that's an even more powerful cultural shift that will allow their company to be even more successful, not just the handful of folks who are in the diversity, neurodiversity, autism specific hiring program.
Yeah, I mean, and with all the work that you all have been putting in to be able to research some of these nuances and to be able to kind of get the voice of the collective to be able to start talking through some of the challenges, I'm sure that you're seeing some things on the horizon that you still need to tackle. There's probably a lot of future research that's on your mind right now being like, all right, so yes, we haven't gotten it to the point where all these actionable items are even being implemented, but there's still more to uncover through this process. I'd love to hear a little bit about that. And then also just kind of maybe you can touch on, maybe what some of those barriers are that it's only 2% of the population that identifies autistic in the college setting right now when, the autism diagnosis is pretty broad. And there's a huge spectrum to it. So it strikes me as odd that there'd only be 2% of the population that have broken down the barriers to get into college. So maybe, Brad, you can kind of help tell that story and what future research is out there.
I will let Brett entirely take on the future research stuff, but I am actually working on a paper right now that the portion of students with autism who are completing college and then choosing to go to, or sorry, let me back that up. The rate with which autistic high schoolers are going to college has increased dramatically over the last, let's say, 20 years. Nonetheless, there is still a relatively small population of the, people in general who are autistic. And even if the entirety of that group goes to college, it's still really only 2% of the autistic or of the college population that are even likely, if possible, to be a college student. Despite the fact that the rate of college going for high school students with autism has increased dramatically over the last 20 years, the raw number of autistic individuals going to college still represents a relatively small slice of post-secondary education. However, one of the things that's actually getting in the way of both research and implementation of these good practices that we are learning about is that we genuinely don't know how many autistic college students there are. There are remarkably few data points from which we can draw. Some of them are 25 plus years old, and we all know how much both the educational environments and the public awareness and diagnoses have changed over the last 25 years. So that data isn't terribly good anymore. There are internal systems at institutions that don't do a good job of tracking these students. Students don't have to disclose anyway, so you wouldn't have good numbers that way either. Our national surveys that go out to hundreds of thousands of students each year, they've really only for the last few years, within the last 5 or 6 years, started to ask about autism. And even then, for a lot of them, it's only some of the schools that answer those questions, and only every other year that they even put the question on the survey. So right now, it's hard to be an advocate for this population in a space that is considered where financial and practical considerations, lead the decision making, when the most basic question that an administrator would ask me, so how many autistic students we have on campus, I can't answer. And there's likely nobody on campus who can answer that accurately. That's a huge hurdle to conducting better future research and to implementing practices that will maximize these students' success.
Yeah, so first we have to be able to uncover, to be able to open up future research dollars so that people understand the impact that it possibly could have and what changes could have. But what other future research should we be looking at, Brett? I mean, what other ways are we missing the ball right now?
Yeah, well, and I think Brad touched on some really important points there. We're talking about what's valuable and what's funded. Brad and I feel very encouraged that folks have supported our work related to the PEACES study on autistic college student success. And that, I think, is just a reflection of that people are realizing that there are more autistic college students on our campuses and that we need to uncover their experiences. So we're really grateful to be contributors to that conversation. And I think what we're seeing through our 3 years of data so far on this and more data to collect is that we're just scratching the surface. We're looking at as I said, several domains of students' lives. So academics, employment, community, their identities, and their mental health, the psychological part. But we're only looking at this at the undergraduate level. We think that there's a lot to be learned from our graduate student colleagues, for which they are then navigating yet another transition in their academic career, and in some cases seeking terminal degrees. And what does that look like with their particular career intent? We're also seeing emergent work from others, and even in our own study, of the high proportions of folks in the autism community in college who have a minoritized sexual and or gender identity. So there's high proportions of folks who are autistic and queer, autistic and trans, sometimes all. And what that means is that there's additional layers of navigating one's identity, disclosure and unmasking, and also feeling a sense of community. There's some great work out there more broadly in the scholarship about this, and we're taking a look at that from the collegiate standpoint, which is a time of transition, a time of change, and a time of kind of finding who you are. We find that to be really fascinating. We're also really interested in, as we see across the board, there are certain disciplines at times that autistic folks may gravitate toward. We aim to interrupt certain ideas that autistic folks are just interested in STEM. That's not always true, but we see even in our own sample that the highest proportion of folks tend to lean into STEM. But it's also the humanities. It's also the social sciences. Many folks want to pursue careers in autism advocacy and mental health to support fellow autistic individuals. There's endless directions for the research, but more importantly is engaging in work that will change practice. And that's what we're continually excited to be embedded in. For Brad and I, our capital, if you will, our academic capital is often in terms of producing papers and delivering the research and whatnot. But it's also demonstrating that real world impact, creating infographics, appearing on podcasts, finding other mechanisms to make sure that the stories that we're helping uncover alongside our wonderful team are not relegated to just lines in a peer-reviewed journal article that maybe a handful of people will read. It's figuring out other outlets to make sure that the autistic college student experience is heard at a broad level, and that we play a role in creating space for other autistic folks to share their stories. And we're developing some tools right now that will illuminate those stories in a more publicly accessible manner, which we'll be excited to share more about over the coming months. But the research is endless. At the end of the day, though, we want to be good contributors to the overall conversation. And I think there are many outlets for doing that.
No, and you've said now, I think several times between the both of you, is that you've mentioned friendship, community. You've mentioned the fact that it takes an entire ecosystem to be able to kind of create a healthy culture on a college campus. And some of that is like you have a variety of marginalized communities that, in some way is that they work together, whether it's the LGBTQI community and being able to really understand some of those autistic or neurodivergent differences and being able to support each other through those college groups so that they have an active voice and it becomes more, I guess, amplified. Are there other ways that you'd be suggesting that autistic students navigate college life? Because they right now, from what you've been telling me, they are still marginalized. They are under-resourced. There are some challenges and barriers that maybe haven't been tackled yet on a lot of college campuses. So what would you suggest to them as they're entering into college life to be able to know, I'm going to be successful. I can take the right steps and create that. Brett, what would you suggest?
Yeah, and Brad, if you want to add on to this, what comes to mind for me is, and of course, Brad and I are in the midst of, we're going to present with our colleagues some work at our conference in the field all about friendship and what that looks like in autistic college student spaces. And I know you're talking about that, Jeff. What we find among the students we're engaging with is the value of online spaces as an area for folks to connect. So sometimes that's via like Discord and these probably new platforms that I haven't even heard of, ways in which folks can communicate in ways that are perhaps not as maybe in some ways structured, but not as overwhelming and stressful as physically being on a college campus, but in tandem finding those clubs where there are those similar passions. I think we have to give autistic college students more credit. They are extremely clever and strategic and resilient in finding people who they can connect with, but we should also not put all of that onus on them. And that's where we encourage our higher education practitioner colleagues to not only redesign spaces that are more neurodivergent, affirmative, but also that appeal to folks' unique interests. I found even in my dissertation research a few years ago, it was autistic students creating their own clubs because they wanted to find people who share those passions. Mm-hmm. But colleges need to create those avenues. It can't all be self-driven, but they can be adept on that front too.
Yeah, that's such great advice. And I mean, where can people find some of these resources, Brad? I mean, where can they find the research? Where can they maybe understand the challenges and become an advocate, an ally, and understand how to be able to kind of push the agenda a little bit more?
There are several ways. I'll end with my favorite because it's the College Autism Network that Brett and I are somewhat intimately involved in leading. Uh, I think the first place to start is at your institution of interest. Don't go into an institution blind or naive. You've got to talk to the folks who are there to be helping you and understand the norms, the policies, the rules, the things that are going to happen once you arrive on campus. Going to campus believing that it's going to be like what you saw on TV, or for that matter, believing that it's going to be exactly like your tour guide said. That is easy to fall into that trap, and it's also a recipe to find yourself in a space where you're not comfortable being there or knowing how to handle it because it wasn't what you expected. So the first thing I think is to get a real understanding of what your particular institution is like in a day-to-day kind of experience. You can get that from talking to faculty and staff. You can get that from talking to peers who are already at the institution. You can talk to folks who were ahead of you in high school by a couple of years and have got a little bit of that college experience, and maybe that's even a family member. A couple other places I think folks can find really good information if they are looking for a very autism specific program, which again, serve a very small number of people in very few number of institutions. But if you're looking for an autism specific program, there is a database that is hosted on the College Autism Network website that, Brett, I don't know, what's the number up to now? That database started with 40 institutions and
No, it started with 75 several
then.
years ago, and we're now well over 100. So these are programs across the country that on college campuses that serve autistic individuals who are, degree-seeking students and whatnot. And it's impressive. It's impressive to see how this continues to grow over time. And our colleague Katie McDermott is the one responsible for updating it. And we have some cool filters so that folks can find programs depending on where they live in the country, what type of college, what types of supports they're seeking out to.
Sounds like we're challenging your skepticism a little bit, Brett. We're seeing some growth.
I've
My
been in the field
down.
long enough. Yeah, no, I have to have optimism, right? Because my son's going into college soon, and knowing that I've got a daughter following him, not autistic herself, but that it's not just about those individual programs. It's rather, I want both my son and my daughter, who's 3 years behind him, I want them both to be going to a campus that is throughout the entirety of the institution, opening doors for autistic students by being an autism inclusive campus writ large. And that I do think is lagging a little bit. So while the database of autism specific programs is a great place to start if that's the kind of thing that you think your student would be wanting or needing. There's also a series of resources to try to find the schools that you might attend successfully even without those programs. Katie McDermott, as Brett just mentioned, is a independent college consultant. There's a growing number of those folks who have connections to autism and institutions and can help direct people in potentially fruitful ways. There is a new book that the executive director of the College Autism Network, Lee Williams, had wrote the foreword or the introduction for. That's called College Readiness for Neurodivergent Students. That is a workbook that has been put together by some of our colleagues who also started working in this area because of their children. And it's a very hands-on workbook of here are some specific skills that you may not think of needing when you go to college, but that are the kinds of things you can work on and develop while you are still in high school. Then the last bit is I'm going to plug the College Autism Network. Again, it was intentionally designed to bring together the resources and the insights from multiple stakeholders, because students themselves have great insights. So do parents, so do faculty members, so do researchers. And if we can get these folks all working together to share resources, to connect students and families with institutions and their staffs, there's a lot of opportunity for students to find success by working within this really diverse community of post-secondary professionals and participants who are all working to help these autistic students succeed in college. And I think there are a bunch of resources with the College Autism Network that would be a good place to start, no matter what role you have in that system, no matter what kind of stakeholder you are.
Well, Brett, I appreciate the passion, the research, the actionable items you all have put together to be able to kind of create the opportunity for colleges to become more inclusive and better prepared to support all of their students. And thank you for coming on our podcast today to continue that dialogue.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to share with a different group of folks than we normally would talk to. So thank you for the chance to do so.
Yeah, thank you for the outlet and the conversation and good questions.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.